And hello, welcome to AM Language. This is your upper intermediate level. Actually, a series of things. You've got the upper intermediate, you have the advanced, and we have IELTS as well. Let's see. There we go. I can now share this so more people can join us. One moment. Okay, excellent. That's now shared. So we can begin. So in this lesson, because this is I keep on getting confused. This is Friday. Yes, it is Friday. It's a bit strange working from home. You forget the days of the week very quickly. But today we're going to look at oh, something's going on here. What's happening? Okay, it should be fine. I think internet is not working as well as it could do. Hopefully, we don't run into too many problems. So in this lesson, because it's for upper intermediates, advanced, and the IELTS class, I'm going to try and mix lots of different things together in the hope that I can tackle lots of different aspects of language. I'm going to concentrate a lot on speaking and developing one's ability to talk about various subjects with different types of words. We will continue and look a little bit at the upper intermediate side of things when talking about films, for example. But I'm also going to touch on part 3 of the IELTS exam, which is to do with opinions and giving your opinions. So I think that will be one of the main things I'm going to be looking at: how to give an opinion, how to discuss, and phrases that you can use to help help you sort out your thoughts when trying to discuss. So I'll bring in some new vocabulary as well. With regards to vocabulary, I think one of the areas I will probably look at would be I think I'll just look a little bit at the type of vocabulary that we could find in Unit 1 of the advanced outcomes as well. So I'm going to take little bits of everywhere because this is the last video of the week. And then afterwards, please look out for the times for next week and the videos that will be happening, the timetable for next week's videos as well. I'm just going to see if the live chat works. I think it does work. Okay, there's only one of you so far, hopefully 2 people. Okay, that's good. Hopefully that will increase, and then we can, hopefully more people can engage. So let's look at 1 or 2 things. We're going to start off by discussing. And for this, we're going to continue a little bit with stories, telling tales. And we're going to look at some vocabulary that we can use when trying to give our opinions on different stories as well. For instance, you've got crime, the type of crime stories. You've got stories about people who, for instance, if you look at The Pursuit of Happiness, you've got someone who is in poverty, for example, and goes and climbs the ladder. In every type of story, there is some kind of encounter. Oh, now encounter is a meeting with someone where they discover things as well. So we can go through one or two words here to build up our vocabulary when trying to talk about stories and what these stories might be talking about. Later on, we will look at maybe one or two stories as well. So in terms of vocabulary, I'll lay out the vocabulary that we're going to look at here. So we've got words like seeking, we've got revenge, we have uh, disguise, pretend, poverty, encounters, reveals, bound to, it's bound to happen, asserts, obstacles or obstacle, insight, gets away with, and finally, bad deed. Now, the story I'm going to use that can help, I'm going to use a different story. It's not going to be from the book or anything. The story I'm going to use and the story I'm going to tell, which uses all of these different words, is Shrek. Now, Shrek is a animated film starring Michael Myers as Shrek, Eddie Murphy, who plays Donkey, and I can't remember the other actresses. I think Cameron Diaz is the voice of Fiona, but I could be wrong. But obviously, Shrek is a really famous animated story. I'm going to talk about Shrek 1 with Lord Farquaad as well. So how can we use these words to talk about Lord Farquaad? Shrek. By the way, before I go on, we're first going to talk about using these words in the context of a story. And then we're going to take this and then we're going to talk about a real issue as well. So we can have the opportunity to look at how we can use these words when we are looking at a story, and then how we can use these words to talk about real issues as well in discussing and sharing our ideas on different things. So the first word that we're going to look at is seeking. Now, the verb seek is to look for something. So seeking obviously is the continuous form. So for instance, in the case of Shrek, Shrek is seeking for the castle where Princess Fiona is. And there he's going to have to take on he's going to have to take on the dragon as well to get to the castle, to save Princess Fiona, and then to get back to whatever, I think, what's the kingdom called? Far, far away? I might be getting confused with Shrek 1 and Shrek 2, to be honest. Anyway, to get back to the kingdom where Lord Farquaad, obviously along the way he has encounters. So you have encounters. Now, encounters is when you meet and interact with people. So Shrek, along in the story, he has encounters first with the donkey, and Donkey then, well, he first has an encounter with Donkey, and then he is stuck with the donkey. And then along the way, he encounters obstacles presented by different people. So he has to fight with, I think, some kind of Robin Hood kind of characters. So You can have an encounter as well with obstacles. Now, when we talk about an obstacle, obstacles are anything that that are challenges, things that you have to overcome, things you have to beat. So, for instance, crossing the, if you remember, there's a part in Shrek where Shrek and Donkey have to cross a very, very dangerous bridge, and underneath is lava. So that is an obstacle. Once Shrek gets into the castle, he then has to fight the dragon. The dragon is also an obstacle. To get to where he needs to, sometimes Shrek needs to wear a disguise as well. So when you wear a disguise, you want to make yourself look different, so people don't recognize you. A disguise is typically what you might see in like spy movies, where the character dresses up to look like the enemy. So when you dress up in a disguise, you then pretend to be someone you are not. So in Shrek's case, he pretends to be a knight when he has all the armor on, but of course he is not a knight. You then have, we have to remember that Shrek is not, or is not a knight as well, because he also, Shrek is poor. So Shrek comes from poverty as well. So poverty is the state of being poor. Obviously, the opposite to poverty would be wealthy. So on one end, you have poverty, and at the other end, you have wealthy. Um, Now, in terms of the word revenge, there doesn't seem to be actually any type of revenge in Shrek so much. But Shrek is, um, he does want to take, or should I say, Lord Farquaad is the sort of person, is the sort of character who does want to take revenge on his enemies. So revenge is when someone hurts you, and instead of not retaliating, you want revenge. So you want to attack back. You want to hurt them as well. So Lord Farquaad, he is a character who does want to take revenge if he thinks someone has done something bad to him. So revenge, you take revenge. You take revenge, by the way. That's a word collocation. You take revenge. And you take revenge on someone as well. So as Shrek goes along, Shrek, so there is a curse with Princess Fiona. There's a spell on her. So during the day, she looks like a normal person, but at night, she becomes an orc, just like Shrek. So the spell reveals the curse on Princess Fiona. So there we have reveals. Now, reveals is to show. So the curse at night reveals Princess Fiona, and the fact that at night she is an orc, not a person, well, not a human. We then have this situation with the word bound to. Now, when something, to give it context, usually we use this term um, For instance, the couple are bound to get together. Um, bound to get together. I think that was an example over here. Yes, it is. Bound to get together. It was bound to happen. The word bound to means likely. It was likely to happen. This means you are not surprised. This is to be expected. Now, when we look at the story of Princess Fiona and Shrek, as the story reveals that at night, Princess Fiona is in fact an orc, you can then see, well, something romantic is bound to happen. It's likely to happen. Shrek is an orc. She is an orc at night. They are the only two characters in this animation film that are orcs. So it is bound to happen that some kind of romance develops between the two. From there, we then can go on to now asserts. When you assert something in this context, you assert something like he asserts power, for example. He asserts power. When someone asserts power, for instance, if I give you this context, the baddie asserts their power, or society presents an obstacle preventing the hero becoming successful. Asserts is when, I mean, the phrase is almost like he puts his foot down. He puts his foot down. He does a strong action. Asserts is when you act out a strong action that is to achieve something. In this case, like a baddie can assert his their power. So Lord Farquhar can assert his power by having Shrek's swamp taken away from him. A king can assert their power by taking people's houses away from him. To give you another example, from a historical point of view, there's a very famous king. There was a very famous king in England called Henry VIII during a period called the Tudor periods. During the Tudor period, Henry VIII was famous for having 6 different wives. Henry VIII would often assert his power by having people's heads chopped off if they went against him. In his case, he asserted his power over 2 of his wives who he had killed. So it's a very strong action. We then have, we've done obstacles, insight. Insight is when you discover the truth or meaning in something. It's to have some kind of knowledge. For instance, if we look at the Shrek story, what's really interesting is that Donkey is a silly and funny character. He does not look like a clever character, but Donkey does give Shrek insight into certain things, such as his relationship with Fiona. So to give insight, or to provide insight, or to have insight is when you have knowledge about something that you didn't have before. And it's usually to do, we link it to situations. So I'm not necessarily going to say that I'm going to have insight into just any old anything. It's to do where there's knowledge to be found. So, for instance, I would say if you go traveling, if you like to travel, along the way, you will probably gain insight into the way cultures are different and the way cultures are similar. It's something that it's knowledge that you can discover in that sense. So we've now done insight. Now let's look at gets away with. Now gets away, technically gets away with it. If someone gets away with something, it means they're not punished. Um, it doesn't mean that what they did is necessarily bad. For instance, Shrek gets away with marrying Princess Fiona, which we did not expect to happen. But usually gets away with it is often, more often than not, used when someone does get away with doing something and they are not caught or punished for. So, for instance, if we're looking at Shrek, Shrek goes to save Princess Fiona in the castle. The dragon tries to kill Shrek, but Shrek saves Fiona. So Shrek, because he is not killed by the dragon, gets away with it. So that's if we use it in a positive sense. Now, Lord Farquhar, on the other hand, does not get away with his plan. His plan is to marry Princess Fiona, and he lies, and he is not a good king. And because Shrek stops the Lord Farquhar does not get away with his plan. So he doesn't achieve his objective. And finally, we have bad deed. It's quite simply put, a bad deed is a bad action. So for instance, if we look at a bad deed in Shrek, it would be Lord Farquhar taking Shrek's swamp away. So that is the language that we can use when we're talking about a story and how a story unfolds. In terms of continuing a discussion, what or developing a conversation. We can use some useful language here. So, positive and negative. First of all, that's totally insane. Now, insane is mad. Oh, that's totally insane. However, it depends on the context. Sometimes this can be used to describe something that's really fantastic, and other times we can talk about something that is mad. So, for instance, we can say, I'm now going to start using more, I'm going to use it both in stories and a little bit in terms of the real world as well. So in terms of the story, if we take a look at the story of Shrek, the story is totally insane, but in a positive way. We have this ogre who ends up rescuing a princess and marrying the princess. It's a totally insane story. It's because it's quite an amazing story. Having said that, if Lord Farquhar, Lord Farquhar's idea is totally insane in the sense that it's quite mad. It is quite mad. His idea that he can get someone else to do the hard work for him, for example. So we can use this both positively and negatively. We spoke about honest, using the term honestly the other day. The next word that we can use, I would say, is seriously. Now, seriously can be used as what? Really? Or seriously, as in you're speaking seriously. So, for instance, if you're telling the story of Shrek to someone and you tell them it's about a story of an ogre that saves a princess and marries the princess, the reaction could be, seriously? Really? That doesn't sound very like a good story, or doesn't sound realistic. At the same time, the reaction could be, seriously? Wow, that's fantastic. Seriously? Wow. So again, we can use it both in a positive and negative sense. Um, then you literally couldn't something. You literally couldn't, and then something. This to make a point. Like, for instance, if it's a true story that you find it's hard to believe that it's true, such as if we take a story like Schindler's List, you would say, wow, you literally couldn't make it up. It's so incredible. You couldn't make it up. Um, Same if you're talking about a place and maybe it's surrounded by lots of people, you can then say, it's literally, you literally couldn't move. You use this term to try and say, make a point in terms of how extreme something is. Like, you literally couldn't drink any water because the water was so dirty. You literally couldn't go out of your home because it was too dangerous. So I've used this language so far in terms of talking about a story. I'm now going to use it in relation to how we can discuss different ideas. And in this case, I'm now going to bring in an element of the IELTS speaking test in part 3. How to discuss ideas. How can we evolve our ideas? The first thing I would like all of you to think about when you are speaking, whether it is in the IELTS part 3 of the, whether it's in the IELTS exam part 3, or if it's just daily conversation. Sometimes people want to tell you something in a discussion, and there's other times when you and the person are trying to discover something. And the approach is quite different. Now, I would say if you are in an exam environment like IELTS Part 3, take an opportunity to try and discover your answer as well. It can be a little bit difficult to automatically have an opinion on something that you don't know very much about at times. So sometimes take the opportunity to try and discover. So, how can we use all these words when talking about real world events? For this, I'm now going to look at some examples that you could get in the IELTS speaking test part 3. And for everyone else, upper intermediate students and advanced students, this will help you as well, as we're going to look to see how we can discuss ideas. So let's look at IELTS speaking, and I'm just going to look at what would be an interesting topic with lots of possibilities, actually. I think one of the things that we could talk about at the moment would probably be, I think, jobs. Let's go with jobs. Okay. And we'll go with, actually, wait a minute, part 3. No, we should do part 3. That wouldn't come under necessarily part 3. So let's have a little look at, okay. Here's a good one. We'll go with attitudes to food. We'll go with attitudes to food. Now, food obviously is a really topical subject. People always have opinions about food, and sometimes you might think, oh, people are always talking about foods. Well, let's see what language can we use when we're talking about food. Well, let's say the topic of the question might be something like food aid. What can be done to prevent poor people in the world going hungry? So let's go with that. We're talking about food. We're talking about poverty, which we've mentioned, and we can talk about food aid. So, what can be done about food and poverty? Um, well, let's start off by exploring the topic itself. For those of you who are quite well informed on various topics, global events, you will know that poverty and the likes of climate change are very closely linked together. Um, for example, it is well known that in certain parts of the world where the majority of the population is in poverty, um, these people are in a position where they cannot stop to think about climate change. There isn't enough money to think about climate change. Their idea is they just need enough to survive. And can they get enough food for the day? Can they get enough money just to feed their family for the day? So they can't get to the next level of thinking about their impact on the environment, for example. So food and poverty is really connected to so many other wider issues. So let's start off by considering the obstacles. Now, one of the interesting things about obstacles in food and poverty in general and aid is obviously trying to get um, food to people who actually need it when it's in the form of aid or charity. So one of the big issues is, first of all, probably looking at uh, the waste in the Western world. If you look at supermarkets and you look at the amount of waste food that is not eaten and is thrown away, first of all, that is the type of food that could be very good to help food aid for food aid and sending it to places where people are poor. Um, Now, if you take a look at, for instance, um, bound to, let's try and use the word bound to. The thing is, what we do is bound to affect other people in some sort of way when we're looking at food. Um, if we take a look at farming, for example, if we take a look at agriculture, whatever we do is bound to have an impact. It can have an impact on the environment. It can have an impact on the local area. On one hand, you can say having farmland, farmers, cows, and all the rest of it is taking up, is bad for the environment. But if you take away that, you then, well, it's bound to have an effect on jobs, for example. And this is another thing. It ties in with jobs. So you've got food, you've got aid, you've got climate change, you've got jobs. There's lots of things to consider. There's lots of things to think about because each one is bound to have an effect on the other. Now, one of the things that I was recently told, I was talking to someone who is in the world of charity, and he gave me some really interesting insight into the problem of that charities have to deal with. So he was explaining to me, for instance, that if your government says, right, there's 100 million for food aid, for example, and you go along to different charities and say, here's 100 million, we want you to do this. A lot of charities will say no, because they cannot they would not be able to achieve the objectives. The other problem is corruption. So if you're trying to provide food aid, medical aid, or even for that matter, education to certain countries where there's a lot of corruption, the obstacle charities face is how can you give aid with when you have a corrupt government? Because the problem there is that if you have money from a country that are taxpayers' money, and you try to give it to a corrupt government, and the corrupt government end up taking what we would call a bribe, that's then illegal. So you've got lots of difficult aspects here. You've got obstacles, you've got poverty, you've got you're then thinking of how to stop people getting away with bad deeds within corruption. So you've got a whole heap of problems here. But how can you actually use this language when giving an answer? Well, to give yourself some thinking times, let's use this following expression when you want to give yourself some thinking time. Let's consider the obstacles. And we can now actually use the word obstacle, but in an expression as well. So um, let's consider the obstacles. So let's consider the obstacles. Let's consider the obstacles. So the question, if we remind ourselves, what can be done to prevent poor people in the world going hungry? You can reply with saying, let's consider the obstacles. And then you try to give your answer. So that is one way of trying to help further a discussion, especially if you do not know what the answer is, or especially if you are not completely familiar with the topic. So let's look at a slightly different question. We'll move away from food now. Let's look at, let's see, what can another good question be here? Let's go with newspapers. Let's talk about a good one here. In what ways are newspapers better for learning about the news than listening to the radio or watching television? I'm going to change that question. I'm going to change that question a little bit. Why might, because you've got two different types of media. You have mainstream media, and then you have your privately funded media in small YouTube channels and social media. So we can change the question. Why might mainstream media be better than other types of media? Let's consider that. Now, you might not agree. You might think mainstream media is not better than other types of privately funded media. So one of the things we can look at is, let's go back to this word reveals. Actually, let's look at two words in particular, reveals and insight. So the question that we can look at is, if the question is, why might mainstream media be better than other media outlets? Okay? That's the question. And we are going to look at how we can use words such as reveals and insight. We can also use obstacles as well. Um, Actually, let's use asserts as well. So that's the question. How can we start off with the answer? Well, going back to let's consider the obstacles. We can change this up. We can go with let's consider the options, for example. That's a really good way of going into um, answering a question in part three, for example. Again, you might not know your answer straight away, and you have to try and discover your answer. So um, let's consider the options. Again, you can start then saying, right, well, the idea of media is to reveal and to provide insight into the world events. The danger is that individual media outlets, journalists, might want to assert their own opinion as the opinion, for example. So then you can say if it's mainstream media, because more people watch mainstream media, because you have maybe a really wide pool of journalists, it's harder for one journalist to assert their opinion as the opinion. While if we look at small, privately funded media outlets, we can say they might reveal and provide a different insight that the mainstream media don't, but they have more control in asserting their opinion as the only opinion on a topic. Um, so again, I would encourage you to, whenever you're going to give an answer, especially in part three of the IELTS, try and give both sides of the argument. Now, if you're not taking IELTS, still, this is really good practice to do when you are just talking in a normal conversation. In order to develop your language, it's a really good idea to always try and explore both sides or give more than one type of answer. Explore the for and against, positive, negative. It gives you the opportunity to use phrases like let's consider the obstacles, let's consider the options. Um, and it gives you time to think, and it gives you time to try and discover your thoughts in English. And this is another aspect of it. A really big part of trying to develop your fluency is to develop your ability to think in English. If you go down the road of trying to explore your own answer in English, it allows you to think in English. If you already know your answer, let's say in your first language, and you know how you would answer in your first language, that's one thing. But in English, your thoughts might have to be slightly different. You might have to use slightly different words. So to help you, you have to help yourself. I encourage you, try to explore your own answer in English. And in doing so, try and think in English. Spend time thinking of the type of words you can use. One of the biggest mistakes is trying to translate from English into your first language and then from your first language back to English. It takes a long time. It slows down the fluency and it's not nearly as useful to you. Now, let's say we now want to use terminology like, oh, that's totally insane. Here we can be talking just about ideas in general. So for this, we can talk about business ideas. So, for instance, we can talk about certain ideas. I'll tell you what, we can talk about ideas to do with technology and future technology. So, for instance, let's say someone asks you a question about how should future technology be spent, for example. How should money be spent? Sorry, how should money be spent on future technology? Well, this is a very general question. Um, What some people might say is that, for instance, someone might say, it's a totally insane idea, but the idea of investing in um, supersonic uh, planes that can go around the world in 5 hours is definitely what we should be looking at. You could you literally you could actually invert this. You could literally get to Australia in 5 hours. So that's one way of trying to use the term totally insane, but you're using it in a positive way. Another could be, well, what about technology in food, for example? Now, I'm going to go back to food um, because seriously, there's a really good idea. It's serious. It's a seriously good idea, and the idea is something called vertical farms. Um, Now, I am not an expert, but looking into some ideas about vertical farms, the idea is that instead of taking up lots and lots of land, you go up. So you build like a skyscraper of a farm. Um, it's not ideal for absolutely every city, but for some heavily populated cities, it could be a really good idea. You also have something called vertical gardens. Now, if some of you have been to Milan, for example, you can now see some buildings that are called vertical gardens. So, on the outside of the building, people grow trees and all the rest of it and plants, and it provides a really more natural feel to a place. So, that's a seriously good idea if you happen to like the idea of more plants, for example. Um, Now, on a different note, I'm going to go with the idea of space for a moment. Now, space travel is something that captures the imagination. It's what we base a lot of science fiction movies off as well. Um, Now, instead of using the term, it's a totally insane idea, I'm going to say it's an unusual idea. It's an unusual idea. But the unusual idea is the idea of sending bits of spaceships up to space, and you make what is called a solar kite. So imagine a traditional boat with a sail and the wind blows the yacht. The idea is that you build a massive sail in space, and your power comes from the solar wind and from the sun. But not only that, the kite is also made out of solar panels. So you've got both wind and light that is creating the energy needed for your massive spaceship. It's a really cool idea. Um, I don't think it's totally insane either, but I think it's a rather expensive one. I don't think I will see anything like that in my lifetime. Okay, so let's move on to the last little bit. And I want to talk about this last little thing that you could find in the upper intermediate section, which is something called heard it all before. Now, heard it all before simply means it's a story that you have heard before many, many, many times. It doesn't have to be a made up story, it can also be excuses. For instance, if we talk about excuses whereby, oh, we've heard it all before, this would be the type of excuse that, sorry, sir, I didn't do my homework, the dog ate it. It's not a very good excuse, and we've heard it all before. It's the same when we look at politics as well in the world. You will see a politician who has committed a crime or has done something wrong. He comes out and tries to apologize. The apology, of course, is terrible. So we can then say, well, we've heard it all before. There's nothing new. We don't believe it. But here is one aspect. Now, if you are looking on page 13, we've got an interesting uh, picture. It's of a film called Jaws, The Revenge. This time it's personal. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Jaw or any of the Jaws film, but let's just say it's very much one of those movies where we've heard it all before. It's a classic revenge story. Someone tries to kill the shark doesn't die, so the shark comes back to try and kill the guy who killed him. This is absolutely no different from any type of revenge story. If you are looking at stories to do with, let's say, anything to do with vampires, it's always uh, Count Dracula killed someone, the friend goes off, like Van Helsing, for example, lost someone close to him because of Count Dracula. So Van Helsing goes to try and take his revenge by killing Count Dracula. Um, Many stories. Actually, another one, which is a bit of a revenge story, is a bit of history here. If any of you have heard of a warrior and a king back during the times of Crusades, there was a guy named Vladimir the Impaler. Vladimir the Impaler, I think, if I'm not mistaken, was originally from Hungary, and he would fight with the Ottoman Empire. The story goes is that Vladimir the Impaler, when he was young, he actually ended up being captured. He grew up in the Ottoman Empire, then escaped, went back to Hungary, reclaimed the throne as the king of that area, and part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I think my history is roughly right there. Anyway, the Ottomans came along. He fought the Ottomans, and as part of his revenge, as well as what we would call a deterrent, trying to stop the Ottoman Empire attacking, he would get captured enemies, enemies who were captured, and would put them onto a stick. So there are many examples of the classic revenge story where we've heard it all before. Um, the thing about um, the thing about Jaws, and when we look at the reality of sharks, is that if we do watch and observe um, the behavior of sharks, it gives us a really interesting insight. What we can discover is that the film Jaws doesn't really give us a very accurate, if you remember the word from the other day, depiction. If you remember what the word means, write it in the live chat. Um, Jaws does not give us an accurate depiction of sharks' behavior. And when we have studied sharks, what we can see, there's a really interesting insight into the behavior of sharks and their function and the importance they have in the food chain. For instance, we know that the sign of a really healthy ecosystem in the sea is if there are sharks, because they are at the top of the food chain. And it makes sense. If you have the main predator at the top, it means every other type of food chain as you go down the list is also operating healthily as well. The other is the idea of sharks attacking. We do know sharks are potentially dangerous. After all, if you are swimming and someone shouts shark, your immediate reaction would be, right, I want to get out of the water. Not many people would like to think, I'm happy here, unless if you are a surfer. If you like surfing and you are used to swimming with sharks, you might have a slightly different reaction. It is well known, for instance, in Australia, where there are lots of sharks, when the siren, the noise goes to tell surfers that there's a shark in the water, most surfers just stay there. They are not particularly worried. But most people would be. But what's interesting is that humans are not necessarily on the food list. We are not on their menu. What is quite common is that we are mistaken for an animal that would be on their menu, like a seal. What's really also interesting is how few people die a year from shark attacks. So, out of the number of shark attacks, which are very unfortunate, I think on average, there's about 6 people who only die from a shark attack a year. If we then look at the number of sharks we as humans kill a year as a species, that number is uncomfortably high. But this is mainly to fuel certain types of, I think, a type of cuisine called shark soup, shark fin soup, for example. Um, we also can see how sharks behave around swimmers, divers, when the diver is not scared. And this is really interesting one. There's some really fascinating documentaries of these very brave swimmers who go around really big sharks like great whites, but they control their heartbeat. And because they control their heartbeat and they don't show the shark that they are scared or that they are injured or panicking, the shark doesn't pay the same amount of attention to them. So it's really interesting and it provides a wonderful insight. So thank you very much for joining me today with this general upper intermediate advanced and IELTS combo. I'm sorry I couldn't go into the amount of detail that you might have been hoping for in terms of what you specifically were looking at, but nonetheless, I hope that provided some useful information that can help you while you study on your own. Just in case people didn't remember, depict or depiction is to show. So that's from the other day. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I am now going to, in the next hour or so on Facebook, you should see the times for next week's online videos. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. I hope you all remain safe, and I will see you next week. Bye for now.